to this Tasmanian Peace Trust lecture, this year to be given by Henry Reynolds, with much great excitement, I might say. It's being dedicated to the memory of Dougal McLean, who was one of the founders of the Peace Trust, the Tasmanian Peace Trust, and a significant donor. Dougal died recently, and his meeting for Thanksgiving was held last Saturday, so we honour his memory by naming the lecture for him. We acknowledge how Indigenous people cared for the land for 60,000 years. We acknowledge that we have so much to learn from the elders, and we live in hope for a more just future. Chris Schaefer is going to give an acknowledgement of country. Thank you, Chris.
Riakana, Krakena, Riakana, Leprina, Riakana, Paramoon, Riakana, Nika, Riakana, Ligana, Riakana, Poetina, Riakana, Riakana.
I have very much pleasure in introducing you, Henry. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us tonight, and followed much of what you've been thinking for many years, and are very grateful for the contribution you've made to our community and to Australia, and indeed the wide world, our understanding of Indigenous people and our interactions with settlers. You've had many awards and fellowships, and you're a member of many prestigious academies, and you've written 16 books. You are a graduate of UTAS and James Cook universities, and you've taught in both of those universities. So I'll let you start, and I hope everyone can see Henry. If you can't, then I'd like to move to one of the seats which is more in view, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for your welcome. I was a bit concerned when we were told about the danger of fire. I would like to think I'm inflammatory, but not that so much. Now I'll begin as I began my book, Unnecessary Wars, with two texts. Now the first was from a letter written by the great English free trade reformer Richard Cobden to the equally great Quaker John Bright. He was probably the most significant political Quaker in 19th century Britain, and actually resigned from Gladstone's cabinet in 1882 when the Gladstone government decided to shill Alexandria. And I was reading in Bright's diary how he left the club and they were walking somewhere in London, and Gladstone said, you know, why ever are you resigning? And Bright said, well, I just can't accept this use of violence. And Gladstone said, well, I think I'll be able to justify this in the final day. So John Bright and Cobden were both people who believed in peace. And in this letter, which was written during the Crimean War, Cobden wrote, and yet I doubt if there be a more reprehensible human act than to lead a nation into an unnecessary war. And my second text comes from almost exactly 100 years earlier, and this is from the great Swiss international jurist Emmerich de Vattel, in his book The Law of Nations, which was probably the most widely read book of international law in that century and even in the 19th century. He was writing about war. He had this to say: whoever knows what war really is, whoever will reflect upon its terrible effects and disastrous consequences, will readily agree that it should not be undertaken without the most urgent reasons for doing so. Humanity revolts against a sovereign who, without necessity or without pressing reasons, wastes the blood of his most faithful subjects and exposes his people to the calamities of war, when he could have kept them in the enjoyment of an honourable and salutary peace. When to this inconsiderateness, this want of love for his people, he adds the injustice towards those whom he attacks, of what crime, or rather of what dreadful series of crimes, does he not render himself guilty? Answerable for all the evils which he inflicts upon his subjects, he was responsible also for all those which he inflicts upon an innocent people. The bloodshed, the pillaging of towns, the ruin of provinces, such are his crimes. Not a man is killed, nor a hut burned, but he is responsible before God and answerable to humanity for them. Now, I felt that these two statements reflect the two themes that will run through this lecture. The first is the question of unnecessary wars. That is, wars of choice which could have been avoided, wars which cannot be justified by the reason of being attacked or being threatened with attack. And it's my view that most of Australia's wars have been unnecessary wars. They've been against countries far from our shores, which we knew little about, and which could never have presented a direct threat to Australia. Now that, it seems to me, wars like that are wars of choice rather than wars of necessity, and most of Australia's wars have been wars of choice. Now, wars of choice present, I think, to the person, the state, or the sovereign, if you like, proceeding in this direction with an even greater level of culpability in answering those questions of Vattel, that is, the considerations of moral responsibility. Not a man is killed, nor a hut burned, but he is responsible before God and answerable to humanity for it. Now, it seems to me that for a country that has gone to war many times, neither in prospect or retrospect has there been much discussion about the morality of war and about the morality or justice, or even the calculus of costs and benefits. So then let me proceed with these two thoughts in mind: unjust wars and the morality of leading a country into war. There are two main themes from here. I want to deal first with what I think was Australia's first unnecessary war. That is the war in South Africa, or the Boer War, fought between 1899 and 1902. Now, I deal with this because it seems to me it established a pattern which we continued to replicate during that century and into this century. And then, having talked about the Boer War, I want to consider where we are today in relation to war and our participation in wars. So let me begin with the Boer War. Now, it's significant because when it began in 1899, each of the separate Australian colonies, and remember there were 6 self-governing colonies in 1899, they each decided to go to war. That is, there were debates in 12 houses of parliaments in order for this commitment to be made. One thing you could say was that they debated war more seriously then than they do today. And so the 6 parliaments decided to go to war, and then the war itself continued over into the era of the Australian Federation, the Australian nation, the Australian state. And the war became Australia's war. And the Australian Army actually had its birth on the 1st of March 1902 in South Africa. And in so many ways it is unfortunate because the war, in a sense, upstaged the Federation. So instead of this political achievement of creating this federation with a new constitution, with probably the most democratic constitution in the world, it was upstaged by the war being fought on the other side of the world. In a part of the world Australians knew very little about. It was the war between the British Empire and the two Dutch republics of Orange Free State and the Transvaal. Two small, very small republics, landlocked and clearly not presenting any threat to Australia or could ever possibly present a threat to Australia. And in many ways, like so many of those conflicts that Australia has got involved with, it was also in many ways a civil war, because the British parts of South Africa, that is the Cape Colony and the Tau, were equally involved in the war, but the Cape Colony had a great many Dutch South Africans, many of whom had families fighting to the north. And when the Australian troops arrived, they were amazed to find that they weren't greeted as heroes and liberators. There was a great deal of hostility to them, because the war itself was very unpopular in the Cape Colony. And quite clearly, British power was overwhelming. These small republics only had a population of a few 100,000. But clearly what happened was that the Australians gained a taste for war. They gained a taste for the glamour and glory of war. And there were vast crowds which saw off the contingents as they marched down the city streets in Hobart and all the capital cities with the ships to go off to South Africa. And equally, there was very little debate about the morality of going to war in this way. There certainly were opponents of the war, but the war party won the argument all over Australia. And in a way, the Australian colonists felt, well, if Britain, if Mother England, and all these aristocratic gentlemen say it's a just war, it must be a just war. And Australia's first Prime Minister, Edmund Barton, coined the memorable phrase, the empire right or wrong. In other words, we've not only sent our troops, in a way we've outsourced our conscience. Well now, the war itself, the Australians felt that they had committed themselves very well. A lot of the debate was, we proved ourselves, we proved our manhood. We proved that our men were, if anything, better soldiers than the British soldiers. You know, they could live rough, they could find their way across country. Many of them were from the cities, but the myth of the great Australian soldiers was born on the veldt in South Africa. But in many ways the war became unpopular towards the end and lost its glamour and lost its repute. And the strange thing is that it was very quickly forgotten in Australia. And there were no official history of the war, there were no monuments, no official monuments developed at the time. There is, of course, the little man standing on the plinth down there looking from the near where that new bridge is, looking down over the city, and that was the Boar War Memorial, which in a strange sort of way is where I really began investigating the story. Because some years ago I discovered that there was to be a ceremony on May the 31st on the domain for the Boar War. And to my surprise, there was a significant gathering with representatives of government, of the governor, of the city councils, many prominent citizens, and men dressed up in the kit of the period, riding horses, and this was Tasmania's ceremony for the Boar War. Because in the early 21st century, in the last 20 years, there has been this renewed interest in the Boar War. And it began, I suppose, most significantly in 2002 with the centenary of the war. Australia sent a contingent of soldiers to South Africa. The minister of the time went to South Africa to commemorate the war. And then bit by bit, the Boar War was taken up in what became the cavalcade of commemoration that we've seen in Australia between 1996 and the present, which we assume may well come to an end in 3 weeks' time, the 11th of the 11th. But it has been an extremely important cavalcade, which I'll say more about later. So after 2002, we can trace the steps by which the Boar War was taken up into this ceremony of war that we've been celebrating. In 2006, a site was dedicated at the bottom of Anzac Avenue in Canberra, where all the war monuments are. In 2008, it was dedicated and blessed by a Christian minister, you know, one of those more established churches, dedicated and blessed on the 31st of May 2008, and from that time on, the 31st of May became officially Boar War Day. In 2011, there was a National Boar War Association founded, which raised money for the monument. And a short time after that, there was a rally of descendants of the Boar War soldiers. And in 2014, the Australian Mint produced a 50-cent coin, a tribute to those who had served, quote, defending the lives and honour of British subjects. It was a symbol of history, commitment, tradition and pride. And in the official statement put out by the Mint, there was this extraordinary venture into historical interpretation. The Mint said that overwhelmingly the Boer guerrillas were, quote, outnumbered and conquered by Australian troops. But in many ways, it was by 2015 that the Boar War celebration became a truly national event. And remember, this was just after Anzac Day. And the speakers quite outdid themselves. Veteran Affairs Minister Dana Vale declared that those Australians who served in the Boer War began the fine military tradition that would be followed in wars and conflicts over the next century, from Gallipoli to the members of the Australian Defence Force serving today as part of the International Coalition Against Terrorism. Peter Cosgrove, the Governor-General, announced, "These men and women were the first to serve Australia in battle, and they did us proud. Their knowledge of the bush, not the veldt, but their knowledge of the bush, their riding ability, exceptional shooting skills, and the medical attention, they had to realise they had to get the girls in, and the medical attention they provided earned them universal respect, and their loyalty to each other forged the sense of solidarity that lives with our soldiers to this day. In a difficult war far from home, our Boar War veterans showed what it was to be an Australian. In this Anzac centenary year, their deeds are as important and relevant as ever, and they are widely regarded as the fathers of the Anzacs. Prime Minister Abbott was even more fulsome and probably even more extreme. Australians have always served to uphold the rights of the weak against the strong, the rights of the poor against the rich, and the rights of all to strive for the very best they can. We don't fight to conquer, we fight to help, to build and to serve. So in a way, this was the apotheosis of the Boer War. They had been designated as the fathers of the Anzacs. Now, the problem with this is, of course, that I don't think any of those people could have known anything about the Boer War and what the Australian soldiers actually did out on the veldt. And whenever I hear these sort of comments, I remember Vattel. He is responsible for all those evils which he inflicts upon an innocent people, the bloodshed, the pillage of town, the ruin of provinces. And it's the ruin of provinces that is the most evocative. Because the second half of the Boer War, once the Imperial Army, overwhelmingly powerful and overwhelming in numbers, had captured Pretoria, the capital of the Transvaal, it became a guerrilla war fought out on the veldt. And the British simply began a reign of terror. They swept the veldt. And the Australians were absolutely complicit in this, as were the Tasmanians. Because there is a book produced in 906 called Tasmanians in the Transvaal War. And unlike many other publications, there was clearly no censorship. It includes a great many extracts from the letters and the diaries of the Tasmanian soldiers. And they were completely complicit in what was happening. That is, the burning, the looting, the smashing of houses. There are pieces in this book where the young men say what fun it was to smash up the houses. All the furniture, the pianos, the bookcases, throwing everything about, taking what they wanted, looting, killing animals, cutting dams. And the figures are quite terrible. 30,000 farms were burnt in this aspect of the war, and 40 towns. But even more horrifying was the rounding up of all the civilians. The women, the children, the old people, the African servants. And they were rounded up by Australians and Tasmanians and by the other soldiers. And they were marched off and put into railway trucks or wagons, but railway trucks if at all possible, and 250,000 of them were put in what the British called concentration camps. 42,000 of them died in British concentration camps, including 33,000 children. This was the Boer War. This was what the fathers of the Anzacs were doing out on the veldt. And let's just put this in perspective. There's no doubt that the atrocities committed in the second part of the war were greater than the atrocities committed by the Germans in the first months of the war in Belgium, which were condemned around the world, particularly by the British. 4 times the number of Australians who died in Japanese prisoner of war camps, 4 times represented the numbers of children who died in the British concentration camps. And the question is, the British say, oh well, you know, we messed up a bit, we were a bit inefficient there. But I came across, after I'd actually written the book, a statement by Kitchener the killer, in a letter to his minister in London at the end of 1901. And he wrote, "Fighting to a finish in this country and with these people means extermination. It is a very long business." Now, there is no doubt that Australians and Tasmanians were involved in war crimes. Now, I don't mean war crimes as we understand them today, and that is the usual criticism. You are applying standards of today to events in the past, but not so. Because in the beginning of 1899, there was the first Hague Convention, which had finished by the time the war began, and the convention had been about the laws and customs of war on land. And all of these actions, all of these attacks on civilians, all of these smashing of property were totally against what had become recognised as the laws of war. They were war crimes. They were war crimes according to the standards of the period. And the Australians were also well known for treating the Africans perhaps worse than any of the other troops, and also undoubtedly shooting prisoners. There are two accounts in the Tasmanian book of them shooting prisoners. Well, whatever do we make of this? What do we make of this extraordinary gap between the reality of the war and the commemoration of the war 100 years later? You have to ask, did any of these people, including those who rally down there on May, and they'll no doubt do it next year on May the 31st to commemorate the war and talk about the heroes, do they know? And if they know, do they care? And it raises that question of the morality of war. And particularly if you are going to go to wars in countries you know little about, get yourself involved with people who can't threaten you, then the standards surely must be higher. But overwhelmingly, what the Australians did then and still do is want to consider how we fought, and usually highly censored views of what was done, rather than why we fought and what was gained by the fighting. I mean, whatever did Australia gain from being involved in the war in South Africa? 660 dead, and as I say, a great deal of money. So let me then just briefly return you to where I began before we move on. You remember I began with the two texts. One about unnecessary wars written during the Crimean War, and the other written by the greatest of the 18th century international jurists about moral responsibility that the sovereign or any state should accept if they're going to get involved in wars, particularly wars that are wars of choice. So, what do we do about Australia's first war? Do we continue to celebrate the birth of the army on the 1st of March 1902, when the army itself was clearly involved in quite massive war crimes? And if we are going to remember it, surely it has to be remembered and not celebrated. Let's remember exactly what happened and then think about the moral responsibility for going to war. Well, let me move on to the question of where we are now. Now, as I had remarked earlier, we have seen, certainly from 1996, right up until now, what can only be termed a carnival of commemoration. There has been massive government funding, particularly through the War Memorial and the Department of Veterans Affairs, of a great variety of war commemoration. Massive intellectual, cultural and educational venture. You will have seen this whenever you go. Look at the bookshops. Look at the massive production of books about war. Many of them funded or subsidised by government. The films, the events, the monuments, the tours of battlefields, the building of a bridge, the replanting of the Soldiers' Walk, and the refurbishment of monuments all over the country and the putting up of new monuments about the war in Europe 100 years ago. But much more than this, there has been clearly the use of what has to be called propaganda, particularly in the schools. Particularly in the schools. And even in junior school, in primary school. And the message is clear that war has been the defining national experience. Over and over and over again, children are told that Australia was born on the shores of Gallipoli. Australia was born at Anzac. Not in Australia, overseas. Not by people in civil society, but by young men fighting in a war they had no idea what it was for. So this, it seems to me, to be an extremely important intervention by government in the place of war in our society. And it must distress people like yourselves the way this has taken hold. And I suppose the culmination of this great flood of money is the building of the museum in northern France. $100 million to build a museum on the other side of the world. I mean, our own institutions would desperately like to have $100 million. More than France has spent on museums apparently in decades. And Australia has spent more on commemorating the First World War than any other country in the world. It is a really strange situation. And yet for all the thousands and millions of words spoken and written about the First World War, there has been so little real accounting. Was it an unnecessary war for Australia? Did we gain any real benefit from this terrible sacrifice? Could it have been avoided? There is, of course, that ever-present discussion. Certainly there's the remembrance of those who died, the lament, which is legitimate. But there's that ever-present recurrence of the idea, did we fight well? And if you look at all the material, you'll have to say yes. So much of what is written is almost a celebration of Australia's prowess in war, from General Monash and Pompey Taylor down to the ordinary diggers. We are very good at it. And the extraordinary thing is, it's as though they don't take aboard the fact that the war itself was a catastrophe. A catastrophe for Europe. The worst thing that had happened in Europe since the 30 Years' War. And which, in so many ways, I think, marked the real decline of Europe. Europe lost its moral authority in the world. It's as though Australia is still in the era of the immediate post-war period, the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, and not even thinking what followed, what the war caused. Mussolini and Stalin and Hitler and the Holocaust, all of those things which followed from the war. And yet we somehow can feel we should commemorate that we fought some good battles. Well, there are other things which need to be considered when we look at the situation where we are today. And one is the clear realisation and the clear illustration that Australian governments find it very easy to go to war. And the leaders of Australia seem able to withdraw with a calm conscience, answerable neither to God nor humanity. We have inherited from Britain the idea that it is the Crown or the executive government which has the power to sign treaties and to decide on questions of war and peace. In other words, Australia can go to war when the decision is made by the Prime Minister and at best with a few people advising. There's no doubt that Menzies and Hasler decided on their own to go to war in Vietnam, a country they knew very little about. It is obviously true also that Hawke, in a phone call from George Bush Sr., decided to go to the First Gulf War, and equally certain that John Howard committed himself to war when he was in Washington on his own and then came back to Australia. A Prime Minister can decide to go to war, Cabinet will side with the Prime Minister, the caucus of the party will decide, and then it is a done deal. There is nothing in the Constitution which says you've got to go to Parliament. You can simply announce Australia is now at war. Unlike the Americans, where the Senate indeed has a law-making and Senate and treaty-making powers, but also now the custom in Britain where a decision for war has to go to the House of Commons. Now, none of that is true in Australia. Now, as I also said, it is easy when the war is over. No one really asks the proving questions. Was it a good idea? What did we get out of it? Was it a good way to spend money? What is the cost-benefit analysis? Goodness me, does anyone say there has to be a cost-benefit analysis about a war? Of all the actions of government, this is one that seems to escape actuarial scrutiny. Was it worth it? Let alone the moral question. Afghanistan. We probably, because the Australians do fight well, they're well equipped, they're well trained, and they invariably kill far more than die. And we say a great deal about the 45 people who died in Afghanistan. We probably killed at least 500 young men in a country we know little about. We devastated 500 families, all done in our name. But there is no retrospective judgment of government. And this is particularly the case with the Iraq War, which undoubtedly was an illegal war. Now, there's no doubt that George W, lost credibility because of the war, and it is seen as a disaster strategically, politically and strategically. Tony Blair has completely lost all credibility, and the British had a very, very long and searching investigation of why they went to war. When the last troops came home from Iraq, the government, I think it was Kevin Rudd's government, said, oh, we don't want to worry the soldiers. When they've just got back, there won't be any investigation. In other words, you can go to war easily and you can return easily with no searching questions of why you did it. And that remains the situation today. Now, the same is, in a way, the same is true with our current involvements. There's no real interrogation of what we're doing. We often don't know because they say, oh, that's operational. We don't talk about those things. We have an opposition which has given up interrogating government about war and security. There's virtually no real scrutiny. We are still involved in the Middle East. We still have hundreds of troops in Iraq. We have two very large bases in Dubai and the United Arab Emirates, bases to which we've committed $1 billion. It's as though we intend to stay. We still have warships. We've had warships in Persian Gulf waters since 1992, the first Gulf War. And quite apart from that, we have aeroplanes in the Butterworth base in Malaysia, and we carry out surveillance flights all over the South China Sea. And just recently, with no real public announcement, the SAS, the Navy and the Air Force have been involved in the conflict in Mindanao without any proper announcement of what they're doing or what they're there for and how long they're going to be. So that's one of the most alarming things, I think, the absolute lack of scrutiny, the absolute lack of assessment of what is being done in our name. Well then, let's move on. This raises the question about the nature of Australia, about whether Australia is obsessed with war, whether indeed Australia is a particularly belligerent nation. We don't think of ourselves in that light, but look at the evidence. It's now 80 years since the start of the Second World War, and 60 of those years Australia has been at war, somewhere. We've been at war since the beginning of this century, and there is little sign that we're going to withdraw from the Middle East anytime soon. And just think, this makes Australia a rather extraordinary small, medium-sized power. We must have been at war in more places, more times, than almost any other small or medium-sized power. Just consider if the other 150 or so small or medium-sized nations decided to go to war away from their country as often as Australia did. The world would be chaotic. And as I say, there are indications that this is a situation that the whole establishment, the whole defence and security establishment is comfortable with. Why wouldn't they? They practically have an open checkbook, and no one these days really scrutinises what they're doing. I was very struck by a statement made in September 2013. It was just after the coming to power of the Abbott government, and it was the first statement by the new Defence Minister, Senator David Johnson. Johnson had already been the shadow Defence Minister for 5 years. He was Tony Abbott's principal advisor about defence, and he gave out a statement which I presume must have been approved by his department, which appeared on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. And he said that he wanted the army to be battle ready for future wars in the Middle East or South Asia. And he said Pakistan was highly problematic. After 14 years of involvement, he said, in overseas conflict, the forces had a strong fighting momentum that should not be lost. Not, we've been fighting for 14 years, we better stop. There was a strong fighting momentum that should not be lost. He planned to maintain and, quote, augment our readiness for future fights. he said it was essential to maintain some interest for the troops. Got to keep training, got to keep a level of readiness. He clearly wanted a war of his own. But perhaps even more frightening was the statement by David Lay in August 2014. He had been for 6 years the head of the army from 2002 to 2008, and he was then headed up one of the major security and defence think tanks in Canberra when he announced, "We are now involved in the early stages of a war, that is against radical Islam, which is likely to last for the rest of the century." I felt that someone should have sent him a white t-shirt with a red cross on it. So let me conclude by saying that there are many aspects about contemporary attitudes to war and the institutional place of war in Australian life that are deeply troubling. We've been at war from the beginning of this century. Are we entering a situation where we'll always be at war? In my book, I concluded a section like this. The phrase "lest we forget" is the most revered one in the national discourse, but the current enhanced awareness of past conflicts reaching back to the Boar War may be making it more rather than less likely that the same pattern will be repeated over and over again. Australians face the prospect that our children and our children's children will, in the words written by the American poet Robert Lowell at the time of the Vietnam War, fall in small wars on the heels of small wars until the end of time to police the earth. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll be very interested in your comments and questions. Yep.
Today is United Nations Day, and several of us here attended a celebratory lunch at Parliament House today. The Charter of the United Nations was drawn up in San Francisco in 1945 by the generals and leaders who had blood on their hands from the Second World War and who actually did not like it. And so they drew up the Charter with the view to relieve succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Now, how does the UN Charter and its outlawing of war fit into the picture that you have been painting?
Well, it's a very good question. I think that so many of the wars that Australia has fought were fought with very dubious justification, and I mean it is highlighted by the Iraq War, which undoubtedly was an illegal war, and in that way Bush and Howard are war criminals, but no one's going to do anything about that. As I say, John Howard, Avuncular John, is highly respected, but it's as though Australians feel, well, it wasn't really our war, we just went along to help. And if it turns badly, we'll say, oh, well, it wasn't our war, really. We just went along because we thought we should be there. But I don't think the Australians take international law or the UN very seriously. I was struck by this, perhaps most strongly, when I had a conversation with the Chief Justice of Norway, a man called Carsten Smith. And we were talking about this, and I said, he constantly referred to international law and how Norway would obviously do this because of international law. And I said, how is it that you, he said, look, many of us suffered the occupation of the Germans, and many of us were in prison. We know how essential for small nations international law is. And so therefore we take it very seriously. But I think Australia feels it can cherry pick. And the most obvious example is the way in which we've totally trashed the Refugee Convention. And it's as though it doesn't matter. So Australia, although, you know, was there at the conference that Evatt was important, he was the President of the United Nations when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed. There is this tradition in Australia about the UN, but in so many ways we don't seem to take it very seriously, and we feel we can, in a way, we self-innocent. We feel that we are virtuous. We are a virtuous country, so what we do must be virtuous. And as I say, no attempt to assess why we got into particular wars, what we did there, why it was necessary. And as you'll see, when occasionally a little corner of the veil gets lifted and we see the real possibility of war crimes, as in the case now about Afghanistan, everyone wants to shut it down, because if you say the soldiers created the nation, if you say Anzac is the most revered day, then you don't want anyone to say, but look, we know the army has all sorts of terrible bullying and sexual harassment, but it's as though that doesn't touch the image of the Australian soldier. And if you make the soldier your national hero, then you've got to protect your national hero. And so you can say silly things like the soldiers in South Africa were the fathers of the Anzacs. But yes, I agree with you. International law and the United Nations doesn't rate highly. I mean, Margaret was at the UN for 3 months on that rotation of people, and she spent a lot of time. Unlike many of them, she actually was at the UN most of the time, and not just wandering around New York. But she was constantly aware that and this was when Penny Wensley was there, and they would have long discussions about what the position would be, and they'd be ready to go, and they'd get a call from Prime Minister and Cabinet and saying, no, you can't do that, this is what you've got to do. It's a pretty sad story about Australia and the UN. Yep.
Would you like to talk about the possibility of a link between the settlement of this country and the treatment of the Indigenous people and Aboriginals in general?
Yes, I've been asked this several times recently, and I think it's a very interesting question which I have thought about. Certainly, if you take the Boar War, there's no doubt that a lot of the rough frontiersmen were in South Africa, and they probably were much more likely to treat the Africans brutally, and they shot Africans. There's one of the accounts in the Tasmanian book. There was an African nearby, and we thought he was a spy, so we shot him. We executed him. But Australians, in a way, were very successful in compartmentalising their attitude to the frontier conflict. Certainly by the early 20th century, they had virtually written that out of their history. They had virtually stopped talking about it. Remember, it's all happening in very remote parts. The vast majority, 95% of Australians, knew nothing about it personally. They go on hiding this and talking about Australia as being a uniquely peaceful society. There's no doubt that certainly in the remote areas, I mean, the man who was responsible for the Coniston massacre was an ex-Anzac the deeper question that you ask, I don't know, although, you know, it's one that I think about. But there is indeed, just as there is we really have to come to terms with what is done in our name overseas, but we have to come to terms not with what the, in a way, the British did here or in New South Wales, Cook and Macquarie and others, but what was done in the late 19th century by the democratically elected Australian governments, particularly in Western Australia, South Australia and Queensland. Manhood suffrage among the most democratic parliaments in the world, 3 governments, and in the period between 1880 and 1900, lack on it, a bit overhang on both sides, they were responsible for the conquest of North Australia, in which thousands, hundreds and probably thousands of Aborigines were killed. They were killed extrajudicially. And among the most significant people involved in this was Samuel Walker Griffith, Premier of Queensland for much of this period, or Attorney General. But he also drafted the Constitution with Andrew and Miss Clark. And he was also the first Chief Justice of the High Court and was so until 1920. Now, how do we measure up a man who venerated the English common law and yet allowed and presided over a system of frontier law that was absolutely nothing to do with the common law in Queensland? The native police, judge, jury, executioner, no arrests, no warrants, no warrants, no arrests, no prisoners, no coroner's inquiries. People, they just shot people down in the bush. Now that is something something we haven't come to terms with. What made me think about this was the Griffith Review. This year brought out a fully Indigenous issue called First Things First. And in the frontispiece there's a nice little piece about Griffith, saying, you know, what a grand Mongol man and got a university named after him. But this Griffith Review about Indigenous people named after a man who was a murderer. Well, if he wasn't a murderer, he was fighting a war. You see, we have to either accept there was a war in Australia, or people like Griffith and Forrest and Downer in South Australia were mass murderers. There is no other alternative. So it's a roundabout way, but yes, I mean, to try and find direct correlations and causation is more difficult, but undoubtedly, whether it's this idea that in a way you can say, you know, we believe in British law, which is colourblind and equality before the law and all this on the one hand, but on the other hand, you have a system that goes on, runs on into the 1930s, or late 20s, which allows Aborigines to simply be shot down. And in a way that's something like what we have done with South Africa. We simply ignore what the war really was, and we talk about how heroic they were and how they showed themselves to be great. And I mean, the monument's there in Canberra, the horsemen riding across the veldt, these great bushmen. They've probably just come back from, as the young Tasmanians were, smashing up properties and smashing up pianos and putting old women and children and wives into wagons and taking them off to concentration camps. Yep.
Have you had call, well I presume you have, I'd like to hear your ideas on it, your reflection on the social forces that have at various times in our history shaped this public consciousness that is either blind to the humanity of the Indigenous or more lately, blind to the errors of our involvement in more recent wars?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Boer War, the South African War was a classic case of being involved in empire. Now, the problem with being involved with an empire is that Britain and then America, I mean, people talked about, you know, how the Pax Victoria, Victoriana, when Britain was a peace-loving nation. Now, that is just absolute rubbish. Britain was at war almost every year for the 19th century somewhere in its vast empire. Empires have interests everywhere, so they're almost certainly get involved in wars. And so if you say, well, we must stay close to the great power because that's safe, it clearly isn't. It's a place of great danger because you will get involved in their wars. And it's because we didn't become independent. In 1900, Australia had all the capacity to be a totally independent, self-sufficient nation-state. It probably would have been better able to look after itself than any of the countries that became independent before then, even the United States in 1783, and certainly all those that became independent after 1945. It was a highly successful, efficient society. It should have become independent, but it didn't. It didn't, and therefore it got involved in the other people's wars. And in a way, they sort of felt, well, as they did in South Africa, if the British say it's a good war, it must be. Unlike, I'm very interested in Latin America, 30 republics in Latin America. Now, we'd say, oh, they're trash, But what they did, they became independent, and so they remained out of most of Europe's wars. And they remain totally, it's inconceivable that any of the Latin American countries would go and get involved in the Middle East. Why ever on earth would a country, I mean, Australia was farther away from anywhere else, as farther away from the Middle East than any other country except the South American countries on the Pacific coast. Why ever would you get involved in the Middle East? I question their sanity. I mean, why would you? And yet we're still there. We of all the countries that, not only are we a long way by kilometre, we're at such an enormous way culturally. Of which of the societies in the world are most different from tribal Afghanistan than secular modern Australia? Monolingual, Christian or post-Christian, white. I mean, what an absurdity. But there was, I'm sure there were, yes, I think I was here, there were great marches against the Gulf War, massive marches, but it didn't affect. And John Howard, I'm sure, knew once you get to war, the criticism will stop because we shouldn't criticise them when the boys and girls are over there with their lives on the line. And you mustn't question them when they come back or it'll disturb them. So yes, it's a lot of it's got to do indeed by us not grasping the opportunity to be independent. Now, one of the only people who really wanted to be independent was Andrew Inglis Clark, who wanted to be independent from Britain. But most of the others were imperial. They believed it was a family. They believed that we should rush to their aid as we did before Britain declared war. We'd offered 20,000 young men to the British war. While there was still debate in Cabinet and it wasn't clear that Britain would go there. 20,000. Because we felt they were empire and they were our blood. 1942 they found out that all that was rubbish, and what mattered was geopolitical reality, and geography was what mattered. But we didn't learn. And we're, I mean, Malcolm Turnbull, the dear departed Malcolm, makes the extraordinary statement that we're joined by the hip with Trump's America. I mean, have they got no pride? Other questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. It could be a rather depressing one, given what you've spoken about and how the world is and the direction Australia's gone in. And to have heard Peter Dutton say just very recently, as he was stirring the pot to have Malcolm Turnbull toppled, he made the statement that Australia has never taken up arms against its own people. And I remember thinking at that time, what a shockingly ignorant statement to make, given the hideous history towards the Aboriginal people. And you mentioned the Coniston massacre, which was only just one of so many hundreds of situations.
It's okay to be white, we've been told in the last few weeks.
I'm a believer that there is a way forward. I continue to believe that when Jesus said that, there is one creator and we're to love one another, that there's a message of hope there for peace. But can you or someone suggest how it can come about? I mean, how can we get the peace movement activated?
Yes. Well, indeed. I mean, that is clearly seems to be lacking at the moment. And the trouble with Christianity, there aren't many Christians like the Quakers. I mean, whenever did a mainstream Christian church come out against a war in their own nation? I mean, as you probably know, the Catholic priest blessed the Enola Gay as it was about to fly up with the atomic bomb, and the crew went to mass.
And the pilot ended up in a mental institution, the one who dropped the bomb. And that priest became a police activist later.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes, the peace movement at times has been important, but particularly now when there's a desperate need for a public voice, a strong public voice, making government account for what they're doing. And not hiding behind this, oh no, we can't talk about that and that's. But as far as we know, the SAS may be involved in other countries. It's distinctly possible, and we'll never know anything about it.
West Papua, we've never stopped supporting the army in West Papua. Even if we call it Indonesia, it's still our army that we've funded, we've trained, but we can distance ourselves from that. But Henry, I think there is a very simple piece of a simple counter to the argument that the Boar War was the father of the Anzacs. I went with Richard Ely, and he was the collaborator for the war memorials of the First World War, when every municipality in Australia was invited to put in either for one of those funny little soldiers from the trophy committee, or they could have the money for something like a playground, something useful. And it was this extraordinary moment after the war when every municipality around Australia actually said what they were fighting for, what were justified, and overwhelmingly it was children, it was the recreation ground, it was something along those lines. And a lot of them went for the little soldier too. But if you go down to the war memorial near the bridge, the Boar War memorial, and another thing that came out in the First World War memorials was this affirmation of being Australian, and it came out in the carvings, the gum leaves, the motifs of more guns than wattles. At Mount Lyell, it's actually the honour boards of the ranges of Mount Sion and the laurels, the Tasmanian laurels, and it is, as we're now told, it was in a sense of Australians becoming aware of themselves. If you look at the Boar War memorial down by the bridge, it's thoroughly Victorian. It's not an obelisk, it's an urn. It's vegetation, it's carving, it's not Australian. There are cypresses, it's mourning, and it's Victorian. And at the time I thought, what was happening? Because this, as you say, is when Ingus Clark was drafting up the Constitution in his little room in Battery Point, and the draft that left his office to go to the
Well, look, you're going to give me too many things to try and respond.
Sorry.
Let's take the monuments. Now, I know that one of the views is that what did we gain from the First World War? Well, when Billy Hughes came back, right back in Fremantle from the peace conference, he told a meeting of the RSL that the world is safe for white Australia. We've made the world safe for white Australia. It clearly had done nothing of the sort. In fact, it had made the idea of white Europe, it had seriously undermined. Did it make Australia more Australian? No, I think it made them far more imperial-minded. The trouble was that if you had shed so much blood and so many families, every little town, you couldn't question the sacrifice. You couldn't say, was it a good idea? So if you looked around, what did you get out of it? So people said, oh yes, we got out a sense of nationhood. But what I say to people is, what was wrong with Australia on the 2nd of August 1914? What was lacking that was remedied by going to war against the Ottoman Empire?
I think it was courage. I think they lost courage when Ingus Clark's Constitution, which said that the purpose of the Constitution was the welfare of Australia, went to the mainland, met all those premiers who said, no, the purpose of the Constitution is the good order of Australia. And if we follow a queen over there who's the mother and we're just the good children, then it's not morally, we're helping her.
Yeah.
We're not doing it for ourselves.
Yes.
Sorry.
Time is creeping on. I'm sure Henry will willing to sort of chat. You go and have another cup of tea. But someone at the back had the one last question, if you'd like to ask it. Do you want to? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, do you think the advance in technology, especially nuclear ones, would reshape the way we think about war? I mean, back, like 500 years back, you would have to shoot an arrow. Like 50 years back, you have to like fire a bullet. But like nowadays, you don't even have to be in the battlefield. You can just sit in your office, having a cup of tea, sipping your Earl Grey, and lightly push the button, and you kill 10% of the entire world population. Do you think this sort of the effects, the devastating effects of the war being increasingly devastating, do you think this would reshape the way we think about war, or do you think that ignorance and just fear would preoccupy and override morality and reason just as long as humans have existed?
Well, yes, no, I mean, I take your point. Clearly that is important, but probably at the moment the most important weapon in war is the Kalashnikov. A gun. And even more, some of the worst killing in recent years has been done with machetes. There's any number of wars which are being fought with small arms and rifles and etc. So war goes on. It may not, nuclear weapons, we hope, will restrain the great powers, but this doesn't stop war being fought on the ground in societies using quite simple weapons.
As Secretary of the Peace Trust, I'd like to propose a vote of thanks to Henry. I'm also a historian, and I really enjoyed the way that he started dealing with the Boer War, because that's something that particularly intrigued me. There's actually another Boer War memorial. It's in Belrive. It's that little statue that people sort of basically do a loop around. And I was intrigued by the fact that the date of the guy who died was actually after the war ended. I was very puzzled about this, so I did a bit of investigation. I found the guy actually had fallen off his horse. But he still had a war memorial, and as Henry's pointed out, it says, for Empire. And I thought that was quite intriguing. And I've also been doing a little bit of research about why we sent troops to Sudan years before the Boer War. And again, it fitted into what Henry was saying, but they got so enthusiastic in New South Wales that we did send a contingent to Sudan, but we got there too late. So maybe that's why there's no memorial and it's too late. So thank you so much. I always find Henry challenging, whether he's speaking or whether he's writing. We desperately need this voice combating all this nonsense. Particularly as a school teacher, I know how much is being offered to the schools, trips to Gallipoli, essays, this, that and the other. We've got a peace essay prize here at Friends, which I think is something pretty useful. Embarrassed to me, they named it after me. But I really wish we had more sort of attempts to involve students asking the questions that Henry's been asking tonight and that some of you have been asking. So thank you so much, Henry.